Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Earthly Headlines. Today I want to talk about really old cheese and dairy products that are resetting the historical timeline. The headline, this comes out of Penn State. There's evidence of 7,200-year-old cheese making found off the coast of Croatia on the Dalmatian Coast. These are some of the pottery that they found. These are like nice images, but they found some pottery that has some residue of dairy and fermented dairy products and cheese, and they analyzed the fatty residue in the pottery, and they revealed that the cheese is way older than originally. So it pushes back the cheese making by 4,000 years, which that's a long time to push back. I mean, 4,000 years, geez, like 4,000 years ago from today is like the pyramids, basically. 2000 BC, around there. I mean, the established timeline of the pyramids. So that's not insignificant. So if they were making cheese 7,200 years ago and probably beyond, then I think all bets are off in that case. I think we've got to completely reanalyze the whole timeline of civilization. But anyway, here's an interesting detail from this article. The presence of milk in pottery in this area is seen as early as 7,700 years ago, 500 years earlier than fermented products. So the presence of milk in pottery, period, is 7,700 years ago, but cheese is 7,200 years ago. So I don't know. If I were to guess, I would probably think it's much older than these dates that we've come to, because remember, these dates aren't the end all be all. It's just what we've found, what's turned up so far. It's probably safe to say that it goes back earlier. I mean, I always go back to Göbekli Tepe, but Göbekli Tepe is like the oldest confirmed monolithic site that indicates there was some sort of civilizing force present area during that time. At the time, it was buried, so that's probably even older as well. But the fact that Göbekli Tepe is there, I would say that they probably already had milk back then and domesticated animals back then, especially if they had domesticated animals. If they had domesticated animals back then, which I strongly think that they did, then they probably had cheese, fermented dairy products, and all that stuff. Thinking to yourself, why does this matter? Why is cheese, dairy? There are a lot of people who are lactose intolerant. Why would this even figure to build on the big picture, like in the construction of the picture of the past that we have? Well, I'll let you know why in a second. Anyway, there was milk in pottery 7,700 years ago. 7,200 years ago, there's cheese. That's what we know so far. So they analyzed the DNA of the populations in the area around Croatia and the Dalmatian Coast, and they found that adults were mostly lactose intolerant, but the children weren't. So they were able to consume milk comfortably up to the age of 10. And here's what McClure, the scientist, says. He says, first, we have milking around, and it was probably geared for kids because it is a good source of hydration and is relatively pathogen-free. Remember, child mortality was pretty high back then. I mean, kids could die from all kinds of different things. So the fact that they had milk was, if you were a family and you had milk at your disposal, then that was a huge advantage to getting your kids into adulthood. So the scientists, it wouldn't be a surprise for people to give children milk from another mammal. 500 years later, the researchers see a shift not only from pure milk to fermented products, but also in the style and form of pottery vessels. So in the 500 years between having milk in pottery to cheese residue in pottery, they also noticed that there was a cultural shift too, and you could see that in the actual pottery themselves. And cheese production was important enough for the populations back then to make new types of kitchenware, in this case pottery. So that from analyzing that small residue in that pottery, they're able to extrapolate that there was a cultural shift back then, which makes sense and is mind-boggling. Just that small evidence alone. You can get a lot from a little here, so to speak. When only meat, fish, and some milk residue is found in pottery, during the Neolithic, the pottery is a style called impressed ware, found throughout the area. So that that style of pottery is called impressed ware. 500 years later, in the Middle Neolithic, another pottery style is using different technology existed, called the Nilo pottery. So there three subtypes of Danilo pottery, which we'll get into right now. So Figulina is the first type. It makes up 5%. All this pottery contained milk residue. So it was, I guess this type of pottery was made specifically to store milk. Rita was another type, and it was a footed vessel with round bodies and often animal or human shaped, and they have large openings on the sides and distinctive handles. And the researchers found that 3 of the 4 Rita in their sample showed evidence of cheese. So the Rita pottery is what they found in the cheese in. And then the third category of sieves, which use cheese in making the strain treated milk when it separates into curd and whey. And 3 of the 4 sieves in the sample showed evidence of secondary milk processing into either cheese or other fermented dairy products. So you can kind of see through these 3 different subtypes, each type of pottery had its own specific job, like its own purpose, so to speak. So it's actually pretty complicated that they had this system set up, and it wasn't something that they created on a whim. There was a rhyme and reason to doing this, and you can see how important it was to them in their development as a culture. And another observation is, in Asia, there are a lot of people who are completely lactose intolerant. They can't even children, they can't even have milk, otherwise they'll start throwing up or they'll have digestive issues. But it's interesting to see the further north you go in Europe, milk is like a staple. And maybe it has to do with how they developed in their physical stature. Because those people in Northern Europe are huge compared to the people in Asia. So maybe milk did have something to do with it, and cheese and dairy, and pathogen-free milk, which is a big deal, especially back then when there's no antibiotics or anything. So the scientist goes on, this is the earliest documented lipid residue evidence for fermented dairy in the Mediterranean region, and amongst the earliest documented anywhere to date. The researchers looked at the pottery from 2 sites in Croatia and Dalmatia. They tested the pottery residue for carbon isotopes. So this is how they did it. And the reason why they did that is because it indicates the type of fat that you can distinguish between meat, fish, and milk and fermented milk products. So identifying and testing the carbon isotopes was the first step. And then they radiocarbon dated the bone and the seeds to determine the age of the pottery, which makes sense. Like the pottery is made, and then you identify the organic products in them, and then from there you can get a pretty good ballpark range of its age. So dairying, according to the researchers, may have opened northern European areas for farming because it reduced infant mortality and allowed for earlier weaning meaning going from the actual mother's milk to a cow's milk or a goat's milk, decreasing the birth interval and potentially increasing population. So it kind of created a safety net for families to keep having children and to also increase their population, and from there to expand their territory, all because of milk. I mean, not just because of milk, but milk. You can kind of see the profound effect it's starting to have, and cheese as well. It also supplied a storable form of nutrition for adults because the fermentation of cheese and yogurt reduces the lactose content of milk products, making it palatable for adults as well as children. Right, so the fermentation process kind of takes the lactose out, not completely, but it reduces it. And also at the same time, you're getting a probiotic type of source of nutrition. And from there, it can kind of sustain the population even better. And it's relatively easy to do. It's not a crazy process. It's pretty simple to them. You just need the right kind of pottery. With a food source that could buffer the risk of farming in colder northern climates, farmers could expand their territories. So yeah, again, as you go up north in Europe, it gets colder and colder. So you kind of have less and less options for food. And among the options you do have, it would be invaluable to have things that are nutrient dense and not empty calories. I mean, back then they didn't really have empty calories or anything. They were eating pretty much organic everything. But it's without fermentation, it would be there probably wouldn't have been a larger population in the north, just because people would be not malnourished, and there wouldn't be enough people to, I mean, there wouldn't be enough people to sustain the populations, and people would probably have to go back down to warmer climates. But here you can see that 7,200 plus years ago, they were already going up there and they were already developing these techniques. And who knows how they came up with them, whether they came up with them in-house or they were passed down from another group that knew about it. Who knows? But all I can say is that more and more articles like this are coming out, and it keeps redating. Things kept getting older and older, just like what Graham says, right? Things keep getting older and older. Well, I have a feeling that more articles and more findings are going to come out like this, and it'll just keep pushing the date back probably until like 9,000 plus years ago. And then from there, who knows what's left. So this is, I think, a pretty underrated find. And just for clarity's sake, this is actually the Dalmatian Coast off of Croatia. So you can see that first of all, it's a coastal area, so people were living there back then. But also, there are a lot of islands. There's freshwater lake here. So there is a lot of natural resources around here to sustain a population. So it makes sense that they found some evidence here. So what's the next step? The next step is to keep excavating and keep trying to find something older, because there's a lot of stuff out there still, and who knows what they'll find next. If you guys have any questions, comments, or anything like that, please don't hesitate to leave one at the bottom here. I'll have a link to in the description below, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.